I'm pleased to welcome Leah Beck and Sue Steyer from the University of Extension Service to tell us all about composting.
Well, good evening, all. I'm Leah, and Sue's she's Sue, and we are excited to talk about composting. It's I think I speak for both of us when I say it's one of our favorite topics to talk about when we talk about gardening things. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to see, oh, I gotta advance. Goodness. Bear with me. I'm trying to move to the next slide.
I think if you hit enter.
Okay, there we go. So tonight, just an overview of things we're going to talk about. You know, one thing I do want to stress, though, and make clear, we're going to talk about guidelines tonight of how to compost, and more or less like the best practices. But really, compost is very forgiving. It's something that you can do, and even if you make a mistake, it's still forgiving. You still, you know, it's likely that you're going to have nice compost. But we're going to go over some of the benefits of it and, you know, methods and how compost happens tonight and how you can prevent some common problems. But I just want you to keep that in mind as you're, you know, taking on, if you're new to composting, you know, just take that on. Don't be intimidated. We're going to talk about some stuff tonight, but it's forgiving. If you make mistakes, you'll still be okay. So what is composting? Composting is basically breaking down organic materials, and those materials can be food items, food scraps, that can be your yard waste, and it creates a soil conditioner or a fertilizer that makes soil very fertile, and we call this substance humus. Excuse me. There's millions and billions of fungi and bacteria and microorganisms in the compost pile that you know, they feed off what we put in the compost pile. They reproduce, they die, they recycle, and they create this fertilizer. And this, you know, composting is not, it's something we do as gardeners, but composting is a natural process. It's a decomposition that occurs in nature, whether we build a compost pile or not. When we build our own compost pile, we're, you know, simply taking advantage of a process that nature takes care of for us. So what, just another, you know, a graphic for why we would want to compost. And this is at the macro level, and it's a little bit hard to read, but I think you can just visually at a high level look at the red spots on this map of the Earth, you know, the total global map. And you can see, you know, we are, you know, right off the Great Lakes there, right in this red zone here. We are in an area with very degraded soil. And, you know, there obviously are other places all across the world that are having degraded soil. You know, it's important to the home gardener too, because our food system and ecological systems are under threat. You know, there's projections of when our topsoil is going to run out. I've read some that are 40 years, some that are 80 years. The UN's Food and Ag Organization projects that if we continue current agricultural practices, we're going to be out of topsoil in 60 years, which, you know, without topsoil, we don't have food. So it's important, you know, for the home gardener to do our part in that as well. So, you know, compost is beneficial. It benefits the environment, but it also benefits your pocketbook. You know, there is really nothing you have to purchase to compost. I said nothing you have to. Now you can purchase some things, you know, some composting bins or maybe some tools to turn your compost. But, you know, technically there is nothing that you would have to purchase to put into your compost pile. And, you know, the compost is just this black gold that we put into our gardens, into our soil. It makes our soil so much more fertile, and it, you know, creates a really nice structure for the soil that makes it fertile, but also helps it retain moisture and water. And when you compost, also it, you know, can protect you from certain pathogens and diseases, particularly if you hot compost. And you know, when we a lot of our conventional agriculture or our food systems are grown using synthetic fertilizers. And we've really, starting to see the price we've paid for using synthetic fertilizers instead of compost. The Journal of American College of Nutrition has compared nutrients in crops grown in the 1950 to 1999, and there were significant declines in nutritional value of our foods because of the soil. And there was declines in protein and calcium, phosphorus, iron, B12, B2, vitamin C. So compost is a very beneficial way to get nutrients back into the soil. So that's another reason why we like to compost. And lastly, but not insignificantly, decomposing food in our landfills is the third largest source of methane emissions in the United States. So, getting some of that food waste out of our landfills definitely is going to have, an imprint on our footprint as well in terms of our emissions. And when you think about it, up to the 20th century, everyone composted. I mean, if you gardened, and which most people did, if you gardened, you composted. You didn't have synthetic amendments to add to your soil or other options to add to your soil. It was just something everyone did. And it was what we did before commercial fertilizers were even made available. And it's forgiving. Don't be afraid of it. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Sue, who's going to talk about how compost happens.
So, how does it happen? Well, it happens in nature on its own, but we're going to give it 4 things in order for you to have a little bit of control over it. And like Leah said already, it's forgiving. It's not an exact science. So don't worry about things you might hear that make you nervous, because it'll still happen. So the first thing you need are the organisms, but they're already there. So what you have is a living system, and your job is to make a home for them so that they will grow. And as they grow, they will be eating, and they're going to be eating what you're going to put in your compost area. So you have the little microorganisms. So those are the things like bacteria, fungi. We want to try to have more of the oxygen loving bacteria rather than the ones that can survive without oxygen. And the reason for that is because of smell, and we'll get into that a little later. Then you have the bigger organisms, which are the ones you can see, the macroorganisms. So those are going to be beetles, large things. And they're the ones that are actually going to do a lot of breaking down as well. Okay, next slide, please. So the second thing, if you've got the organisms, you have to feed them, and that's what you add to your compost bin. So we've said organic matter. That doesn't mean organic in the sense of, you've got to buy pesticide free or whatever. I mean, that's all very good to do, but by organic matter, we just mean that they came from living things. So they have nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen in them, stuff that was once alive. So the general rule of thumb is something in the range of, you want between 1 and 3 parts of brown materials, and Leah will go into a lot of detail on that, to 1 part of green materials. So the brown materials are the more carbon containing materials, and they're used for providing energy for the microorganisms. The nitrogen are green, so that's you could pretty much go by that rule of thumb. And those are going to be, the greens will provide, we say cell function. That means it's found in DNA, in enzymes, things like that. And both carbon and nitrogen contribute to the structure of the organisms. So it's really important that you have something to the effect of a 1 to 3 part brown to 1 part green, but you can finesse that, and it's forgiving. The other important thing about feeding them your organisms is you want the smallest particle size, that you don't want to throw in a half of a watermelon. That'll just sit there. It won't be broken down. You have to chop things up. We always say something around the size of your palm works really well. So the smaller, the better. It'll break down faster. If you chop them even further, they'll break down even faster than that, but minimally around the size of your palm or even your hand. The other thing is you need to have a correct volume of this. You can't really get compost going if you have a pile that's yay big. There needs to be, and Leah will talk again on the particulars of that, around 3 by 3 by 3 size of, and that's in feet, size of material in order to have enough volume for these organisms to break down this material. Okay, and the next things that you need are water. So they do need moisture. They're living organisms, and we just say about the amount of water as if you had a wrung out wet sponge. So a lot of times the materials that you put in are providing enough water, so you may not have to add it. But if you're in a dry period, you will likely need to just monitor your area and see if it's wet enough, and add some water. And the last thing is you need to add oxygen. And to do that, you turn your pile or your materials in some manner or another. So you want to have, as I said before, the organisms that are oxygen loving, especially the bacteria that are oxygen loving. The ones that don't love oxygen will make a stink. So the ones that love oxygen you'll have a smell-free pile. So you put the air in, or the oxygen in, by turning or mixing or even adding wood chips. So those are just some ways to get oxygen in to that. So the last thing, and Leah mentioned hot versus cold composting. Composting actually happens at a wide range of temperatures, but we usually split the composting into cold and hot, because we like to make things simple. So if you don't turn your pile or stir wherever you have your compost, you're not going to be putting in enough oxygen, and you're going to probably end up doing what is called cold composting. So if you're not paying attention to, oh, I'm just going to throw all my food waste in here and not worry about how much it is and how much green and how much brown. I'm not going to worry about whether I put water in there. I don't care about the size. You will get breakdown, but it's going to be passive and slow, possibly up to a year. Sometimes that's even called moldering, but you will get composting. If you want to speed things up, you would do a little more work. So that would be turning your pile or stirring your bin or whatever method you're using, and getting the temperature up to somewhere between 122, 128 Fahrenheit. So that gives it, and you're also going to be balancing your food so that you are paying attention to how much green and how much brown you're adding, and you are going to be within the right volume. So those are going to be the situations and the conditions that are going to keep the bacteria at their optimum. At 150, you can kill all sorts of seeds, which is good, especially if you like to put your tomatoes into a compost area, and then when you spread it in your lawn, you see little tomato seedlings coming up. So hot composting is going to kill seeds. It would even kill diseases, but we still recommend that if you have some diseased material, like you have the powdery mildew on your squash, don't compost that, but throw that into the trash. And we have had questions before about jumping worms, and they will be killed at 104 degrees F for about, it takes about several days to kill the cocoons. But if you happen to have worms, adult worms in your bin, and it starts to get hot, they're just going to move away from the heat, so you aren't going to be killing them. Okay, so I think now we have time for questions.
Yeah, I failed to mention in the beginning, if we're going to make a couple stops throughout this presentation for questions. Or, you can, jump in with a question now, or if you're more comfortable, you can put a question in the chat and we'll address those. I also failed to mention in your chat box, at the top of your chat box, I put some links in for some of the resources that we find beneficial in composting. So you'll find those, if you want to copy those out, if you're interested in those, you'll find those at the top of the chat. So the question is, were the boxes on the left in the last side cold or hot composting? So
that's a good question, because the answer is really either, kind of. And Leah's going to go into that in a lot more detail. So the actual methods are coming up, and we have another question. When you have open boxes, how does the rain affect it? Well, right. If you're having a really rainy time, what's going to happen is it's going to get too wet, but it'll dry out. So it's not going to kill anything. It's just going to slow things down. So again, like Leah said, it's very forgiving. So yeah. And we'll get into the details of the specifics of setting up a compost bin or pile or method coming up right now.
So I'm having a little. Sue, did you happen to move that last slide, or was?
No, I can't move anything.
Okay.
You're driving, and I'm glad.
Yeah, it's not responding for me. So hang on just a.
Yeah, just press, if you try enter, does that, your enter button, your return button, is that doing anything?
Give me just a second. I'm going to bear with me for a minute. I want to my slide to the right page and see if that helps.
There you go.
Okay. All right. So we're back on slides. So how to compost. We're going to get into further into different more detail exactly what you can put in and how to do the compost. But like I had said earlier, there's really nothing you need to purchase. And it depends on what you have around. I mean, if you have a lot of food scraps, it's a great way to use food scraps. Like I had mentioned earlier, the landfills that are filled with food scraps, it's, to our benefit to get those out of there. And, we have a lot of food waste as well. So, a lot of the foods that we have are able to be composted. You also might have a lot of yard waste, or if you mow your lawn, you might have clippings and things of that nature. So the thing we got to get our arms around is the organic materials that we put into our compost pile. So what goes in? So Sue had mentioned that we try to keep this balance of brown to green. Browns, you'll hear us talk in any composting, you'll hear us people talk about browns and greens. The browns are where our source of carbon, our greens, which is what I'm going to talk about on this slide, is our source of nitrogen. So what qualifies as a green? What is it that we need? And this is, when you're thinking of ratios of how much green, you want about half as much green as you have brown into your compost pile. So some really good, and this is not an exhaustive list that I have up here. There are other things you can add to your compost pile, but it's, the most common things that people have available. So you can add your grass clippings, and I would recommend, if you treat your lawn in any way, whether you add fertilizers or if you put a weed suppressant on it, I would not throw that into your compost pile. It's highly concentrated items, and things, synthetic things in there that you wouldn't want to put into your compost pile. So only use your grass clippings if there's no chemicals that are sprayed onto your lawn. But any of your fruit and vegetables, coffee grounds. I want to step back on fruits and vegetables, and this happens. I have friends or family come over, and they know I compost, and I keep a compost bucket underneath my kitchen sink. And a lot of people that come here frequently, they know where it's at. And when we're cleaning up after we eat, they want to scrape the leftover salad into my compost collector. And I'm always like, wait, don't put that in there, because your fruits and vegetables shouldn't have any fats or oils or dairy products on them. So you want fruits and vegetables that haven't, for example, you don't want salad that has a salad dressing on it. You want fruits and vegetables. They can be cooked, but don't, if they were steamed or baked or roasted or whatever, and with no oils, you can put them in your compost pile. But, avoid anything with this, have any kind of fat on it. Coffee grounds, tea bags. I try to, I watch the tea bags. If they're staples, I pull those out. Some manures, horse, cow, rabbit, chicken, no dog. You don't want any pet in there. And just a word of caution, if you do use manures, you want to make sure that you fully compost, or you let the composting process happen before you were to spread this on any vegetable garden. It's perfectly safe, but you just want to make sure that it gets well composted. If you have hair and fur, some fibers can go in there. Nutshells. I eat a lot of pistachios, and I save all my pistachio shells and throw those into the compost pile. And like Sue said, size does matter. That's not to say if you put a big something in there, it's not going to break down. It will. It's just a lot quicker if you can get it into a smaller piece. In the fall, when you see the Brussels sprouts available in the grocery store, or maybe you have fresh Brussels sprouts where you have the great big, it's like a 2-foot long stalk, and you have this big stalk. I always want to compost that thing, but I always break it up into smaller pieces, and if I don't, I learned the hard way because I didn't always. And, that thing would be in there for like over 6 months. It just was really slow to break down. Other things like Sue had said, like a watermelon rind, it's best if you can cut it down into smaller pieces. I don't compost breads and grains. Some people do. I don't. Breads might have a fat in it, and that would attract some things that rodents that I don't really want to bring to my compost pile.
Yeah, I'm going to just butt in and say
Yeah,
that
jump in.
I'm a lot more liberal about what I compost. I compost salads that have oils on them. I've composted a pint of oil into I have 4 bins over a few months, because they're closed, so nothing's going to be attracted to it, and I just make sure I stir up everything. So I don't follow the rules. Leah follows the rules.
Yeah, we're yin and yang and a lot in gardening.
Yeah.
So that was green that we talked. Now what's brown? And these photos are from my garden in the fall, and you'll see I'm a scavenger for browns. Keep in mind the ratio is 2 to 1 that we want for our compost. So I'm always going to need more browns than greens. So these are, it's hard to tell a little bit in this photo, but up in the right-hand corner here, these are my tomato cages that after I'm done growing tomatoes in them, I fill them up in the fall with leaves that I find on my leaves, my neighbor's leaves, all the leaves I can find around. And it's amazing. I need to add a photo to this slide of, this is the leaves before we've had any rain or snow. But after we've had rain or snow, the first rain or snow, those leaves are down to about less than a quart. They all shrink down to be only about this level height onto my my bins that I have. But I try to scavenge all the browns that I can. You could have leaves. Leaves in the fall are one of the easier things to find, and if your city just takes them away, it's something. It's like just one of the most beneficial things you can add to your soils. Eggshells, plants and flowers. Some ashes from wood burning fireplace. Just a note of caution. I learned by my mistakes, and I early on when I was composting, I heard ash is good, and I had a charcoal grill. And I had to empty out my ashes out of my charcoal grill, and I thought, oh, I'm just going to dump all these onto my garden. I put them directly onto my garden bed, and I had real problems for like a year after that. I couldn't get anything to grow. I couldn't get any seeds to germinate. So do not use any charcoal ashes, but wood ash in a small amount is okay to use. And cotton textiles. You're going to need, I can't really stress enough that you're going to need lots of browns. And it's, kind of nice to have kind of a stash of browns. So we have a couple questions.
Yes, the questions. So one question was about, are leaves green or brown? And I sort of answered that in there saying it depends, because if they're fresh, they're green. If they're dried out, they're brown. And that goes for a lot of things. I sometimes will let certain things that are greens, I lay them on the side and let them dry out, and then I have browns. The other question was about paper bags and newspapers and things like that, and paper towels. What are those considered browns, and can you add them?
Yes, you can add them. I would, if you're using paper bags, I would recommend you tear them up, or if you're using some newspaper, tear it up a little bit, because it can get kind of a little bit tough to deal with in your compost pile. And a lot of people will add like toilet paper rolls or paper towel rolls, and kind of rip those up, so little pieces of cardboard. You just you want to keep in mind you're going to want to turn this at some level, and you don't want a big mat of a bunch of brown bags in there. So, I would kind of tear them up or shred them up and add them to your compost pile if you choose to use bags. All right. So I'm having a delayed reaction. I'm moving forward again. So let's see if our slide will cooperate with us and go down. Bear with me, I'm going to have to advance again. Okay. All right, so what not to compost? I kind of talked about some of these things. Any fats, I don't put meats, any bones, any grease of any kind in mine. I don't put baked goods. Sue does. Like I said, salad that had been tossed with dressings, dairy, anything treated, any treated lumber, no charcoal ash or coal ash. The manures we discussed, black walnut leaves are something to be aware of. In general, I would say leaves are fabulous. But if you have a black walnut tree in your yard or in your neighbor's yard, you don't want to add those to your compost pile. Or anything diseased. If you've got something, if you have I grow squash every year, and inevitably I get on my squashes powdery mildew. And, I just am like, I don't really want to put that into my compost pile. I don't know what, that's going to do. So I put that separate and I bag that. So if you have anything diseased or anything that's been exposed to any kind of chemical, I wouldn't put that into your compost pile. And if you're going to be doing cold composting, I would not include any weeds that have a flower head on them or that they've gone to seed. However, if you are doing hot composting, you can add weeds that, like say a dandelion flower or something else. You can add that to your compost pile and it will make the seed not be viable.
All right, Leah, we got a question about adding string algae from the pond. Can you
I'm not
compost that?
familiar with string algae.
It should be okay.
I would, my gut would say it should be okay, but I don't know for a fact.
I mean, algae is, it doesn't produce, if your algae doesn't produce any toxins, you know, some aquatic organisms, like I'm thinking of red tide and things like that, but if you're pretty sure your algae is innocuous, I would say just it can be so stringy that you might need to chop it up. Probably the thing I'd do is put it outside the compost bin and let it turn brown and then cut it up and put it in. I don't know. Hey, Leah, you want me to try my slides?
Well, yeah, I'll reshare here again. I think every time I go into the chat, it won't then let me go into.
Don't go in the chat then. I'll go in the chat and read them. Yeah, that must be it.
So we've got our greens, we've got our browns. We mentioned we want this 2-to-1 ratio. Now I have this chart up here that looks, like, oh my gosh, it's really precise. I'm not this precise at all on my garden when I compost. I use just a pile for compost. I don't have any fancy composting bins or anything. And I add my materials. I keep under my kitchen sink, I keep like a bucket thing that I put with a lid that I keep my kitchen scraps in as I'm in the kitchen and I'm cooking, or if I got, something to throw into the compost. And then I'll take that and dump that onto my compost pile. And then when I think I've done that enough for a few times, then I'll take a pile of leaves and I'll dump that on top. And then I'll just kind of keep repeating that process. But, this is just directional. This is, guidance. It's not, you don't have to be precise into this, but, just kind of keep in mind that you want to have, browns and carbons, which are your leaves or your straw, your hay, your greens, which are your kitchen scraps, kind of in a 2-to-1 ratio. And you can keep building them on top of each other. This would be a cross section. And Sue had mentioned early on, ideally, we want this pile to be about 3 foot wide minimum, up anywhere from 3 foot to 5 foot wide, 3 foot deep, and 3 foot to 5 feet high for the composting to effectively break down. Again, that's guidance. I can tell you my pile will be, it's 3 foot high sometimes of the year, part of the year, but not all of it. I keep my pile as kind of a working pile all the way from like April through November. I let it rest pretty much in the winter because it's frozen. But mine is not, I'm not that precise with mine. But I also am not real effective at getting hot composting. I'm more lean towards, I get my hot composting going in the depths of the summer, probably like in June and July. But the rest of the times of the year, I'm probably more in that cold composting zone. So this is guidance. Anything I overlooked there, Sue, that you think I need? Okay. All right. So composting methods. I'm going to share with you on the next several slides some different ways you can store or collect or build your compost pile. And just keep in mind, these are, again, it's all forgiving. You can just have a pile in your part of your yard if you want to, or in a corner of your garden. But there's heap holding units that you see on the left here. And these are kind of nice because you can build your pile here as they've done in this right section of this. They've got their 3 foot high pile built. It's doing, composting, it's breaking down. And over here, they've collected their brown materials. So, that's just kind of a convenient way to hold and designate your different piles that you're holding. I've seen other units where they have a third bin or third section in here, and that might be the compost that's ready to be used. You can purchase bins. These are nice if you want to keep your yard real tidy, or if you have a small space you want to just tuck it into. They're convenient for that. They're a little bit more difficult to turn because, you know, we want to aerate our compost pile. So these are a little bit more difficult to turn your compost pile, but, you know, those are effective as well. You could just, you know, this is a snow fence bin. This is just, you know, you can, you know, put a quadrant around, put some fencing around it, and put your, build your compost pile that way. Here's again, that 3 bin system that I talked about on the previous slide. If you just a little bit of a caution, if you do use some wood or any kind of wooden structure, make sure, or get fencing, you know, make sure that you don't get any treated lumber. You know, treated lumber has toxic compounds in it, and you certainly don't want that to be leaching into your compost pile. And then some other creative ways to store your compost are, you know, this chicken wire. You can just build a cylinder of chicken wire. You might need a garden stake in that to make that sturdy and to stand up. You can drill holes into a garbage can and use a garbage can. And this is just a system using old pallets that are put together and have a compost bin that way. So, you know, it's really pretty forgiving. We also, you know, there's also ways you can just even do a pit composting. These are really effective if you're going to start a new garden area or you have an existing garden area. And you could just, you know, dig a trench, or in the fall, you could dig a trench or dig a hole into it. And then just fill that hole with green and brown matter, your material, your organic materials, and then, you know, cover it up with soil after you put it in there, and just leave it there. And you'll never, you know, just let it decompose. You're not going to be able to turn it, but it will eventually decompose, and it will enrich that soil where you've done your pit or where you've done your trench. So those are kind of, I have done pit composting, and I've done lasagna composting and trench composting when I want to start a new garden bed. So the year it takes, you know, you got to start the season the year before you want the bed. So, you know, if I wanted a new garden bed for this growing season, I would have had to start this last, you know, probably July, August, and have done my pit and let everything decompose in the soil. But, you know, it's a nice way to add nutrients to the soil as well. Again, you know, the methods that you use and how you compost and how you store your compost, a lot of it's going to depend on what you want to use your compost for. If you want to, are you composting because you want to make better use of your kitchen scraps, and so you just will have an amendment to spread around some beds? Or are you gardening or are you composting because you have a large garden that you want to be able to have compost to amend your soil? So whatever your, you know, specific thoughts are around composting, it's pretty flexible in the method that you would choose to compost with. So we will take questions. Sue, I'm going to let you open the chat.
Yeah, I did. Someone just wanted to know if this talk was going to be available later, and that the answer is yes on the library's YouTube. But questions. I'm a bin composter. I mean, I have composted in my youth in a pile, but I'm the one that has 4 bins, and they do sell a corkscrew-like device that you can stick down into the bin and rotate, and it aerates. And I have gotten hot compost going. But again, it's in the, you know, in the warm part of the season. But I do continue to compost kitchen waste throughout the winter. The only thing that slows me down is if the bins are iced shut. then I'm in trouble. but it doesn't do much. But I have leaves like Leah does on the side, and if I have looks like, oh, too much greens, I just throw a handful of leaves, dried leaves. So we have nutshells. We're in green and brown section of composting materials. Is it both green and brown? Well, uh, everything that's green, all right, everything has carbon and nitrogen in it. It's just where along the continuum is it a little more to the carbon side or a little more to the nitrogen side? And I don't know. Leah, do you know like pistachio shells? I it's hard to say. Do you count
Yeah,
them as browns or
I guess I consider them a green primarily only because they go in with my food waste, which everything else is a green. And so in my mind, I think of them as a green, but it's really not grounded in any science. So I'm not sure.
right? But everything, everything has carbon and nitrogen in it. It's just, and that's why it changes. The composition changes when the your grass clippings turn, they're fresh and green, they're greens, but if you leave them sit out and they turn brown, they have decomposed, so they're now containing a little more carbon than they had of nitrogen that they had when they were fresher. So yeah, sorry, that's a yeah. And then uh, how does the three bin system work in practice? Um, I can. You want to answer that, or I can answer
You
that?
can go, you can answer.
Okay, so what you do is you. It's really like you start off and you put all your browns and greens in one bin, and you stir that around, and yeah. But you start to get more browns and greens, and that first bin is full, and you think, well, I don't want to add fresh stuff because this stuff is already breaking down. So you start another. You use your middle bin, for instance, and then you start adding that while you're still turning the first one, and then when the middle one fills, you start the third one, and by the time the third one is full, your first one hopefully has turned into compost that has sat for a little bit and is ready to use. That's probably the most classic way of using a three bin system, but people will use three bin systems in whatever method or way suits them. Like they may use one bin as a holding bin for browns. Uh, and it just depends. It depends on how you feel like using it. But the classic method is to just move from one bin to the next, because once you fill one and it starts to break down, you don't want to add new stuff because it's just not, then it'll never be finished. I don't know. Leah, do you just do one, you do one pile. So how do you manage that with
I
you're always adding stuff?
well, I have one pile in the winter. And so I just, keep one big pile, and it's huge. It's a big pile. It's probably, it is 5 foot by, and it gets usually about 3 foot high throughout the course of the winter. But as soon as I can turn it this spring, then I will start a second pile, and I'll let my first pile kind of start to break down. So in the winter, I continue to add, like Sue, I always add to my compost pile. I don't throw any kitchen waste away ever. Anything that's compostable. Um, I add to it all winter, but it's pretty much just a holding place. It's not that it's, actively breaking down, or I'm not actively doing anything to it. I might throw some leaves on there if the leaves aren't frozen, because that sometimes does happen in the winter, that the leaves are so frozen I can't even, pick them up to move them. But yeah, in the summer, I will, early in the summer, I'll let whatever I've accumulated over the winter, I'll build that up with the browns and the greens. In the spring, I'll start that. And then I will start a second pile that I keep. While I don't have bins, I keep my piles separate as if I did have bins.
Okay. So we have a question about boxes being used as brown, and yeah, I think nowadays they're using soy ink like on cereal boxes, so those are pretty safe to use. I mean, in the old days they would use like in the 60s, there would be some metals in the dye, and that wouldn't be good to do. The problem with some boxes, like bicycle boxes, that they use a glue, and the glue doesn't break down really well. And I do occasionally use boxes. I tear up a box and put it in there. You just be sure to tear up things small. Uh, yeah, Amazon. That's what I end up putting is Amazon boxes. Uh, tear them up a little bit. I don't think
And
they're pretty flimsy. You
yeah, and
want
I
to
would
use a
take
more
all the
flimsy
tape,
one.
any
Oh
tape
yeah,
or labels off as well. Before you break it, because those adhesives and things you don't want in there. The tape will never break down.
right. Oh yeah. When you get those little banana peel stickers that you thought you got, and they come out the bottom, and they never break down. All right, so now here's one for you, Leah. When and how do you maintain moisture in your compost pile?
Well, last year we had, it was so dry around here, or at least I'm in St. Charles, and I know other areas around us got a lot more rain. I don't know if I was in a microclimate, but we had we had very little rain. So I was, watering it once a week. Um, and I wasn't totally saturating it, but I would turn it and then I would water a layer, and then I'd turn more on top of it and I'd water more. So that was the first year I was really intentional about watering my compost. So generally, when we have, a typical summer season with some rains, I find that moisture is adequate for the compost process for me. Again, it comes back to how quickly you want this to break down. If you kind of just leave it and ignore it and don't add water, and you're doing more of a cold composting, it will eventually break down. It's just going to be a slower process. I don't know about you, Sue. I know you're in the bins. How do you manage the water in the bins?
I have occasionally peeked in, and if it looks kind of dry, I'll leave the tops off as if I know that rain is coming. Sometimes I just take the tops off for a while and let the rain get in there. As if we've had a lot of hot weather, because they're black and they do absorb a lot of heat, so they can get pretty hot in there just from the temperature. So yeah, I poke around and see if I think it needs it. And also, in the troubleshooting with that we'll get to at the end, we'll talk about how you can use smell to tell what's going on as well. Are there any other questions? We'll have a time for questions at the end. We have a little more to go. So
There is a
let's.
question here about, is it worth purchasing the commercial compost accelerators?
Oh, I didn't see that one. It depends if you want to try to speed it up. I've not used them. I haven't had any trouble. You don't have to buy them. They're going to recommend them just because, but you have plenty of microorganisms in all of the material. Usually you throw a shovelful of dirt in after, if you're layering and you're worried that you don't have microorganisms. I throw a shovelful of soil in there, and then you have plenty. Someone says, I have a closed bin, so I buy worms. Oh, I'm going to talk about worms in a moment, because if you do worms outside, or well, you're talking about you buy extra worms for adding to that. The worms, I don't add worms to my bins because the worms find their way in. They just do. You can add them, and hopefully they're smart enough in the winter that they'll go down into that. Your bin is resting on open soil, so they'll go down into the soil. But when I poke through mine, I see worms a lot of times. But there is worm composting, which is vermicomposting, which is something you can do year round indoors, and they won't die. And this is great if you don't have any outdoor space. You use a special worm. It's different from the earthworms that you find outside. They're the red wrigglers, and you usually have to buy them, and you can buy them online, or if you know someone who's worm composting, they can share some with you. And it may take a few months to break down food, but what you're going to end up with is the worm material at the bottom. And so there's a whole I think we put a website in there in the chat at the very beginning. If you're interested in how to do worm composting, you can make your own bin and have a single unit bin, like all the way on the left. You can have a stackable kind of system, which is the middle, and then on the right, yeah, you buy them at the bait shop, the red wriggler. I can never say that. Red wrigglers, and you can buy them from commercial sites. It's something like you'll need a certain amount of worms per food that you plan to put in there. Oh, your bin is raised off the ground? Yeah, check and see. Check and see what you can do about that. So the worm condo, which is shown in the middle, is worms migrate up as they eat the food in the trays. So you harvest the lowest bin, it'll have their worm poop in there, which is the really concentrated compost material. So, okay, next. So they're in quote marks, composting methods. They're not really composting all the way. What you have is, the two on the left are fermentation systems, and it's called Bokashi, and it's great for small spaces, but it makes the product is pickled, but it's not ready to be used on plants. It still has to get in contact with earth. So you still would need to like dig a hole in your yard and put it in, or put it into a compost bin. But what's good about that is that you can compost things like bones and fat and meat and dairy. Yeah, we're going to get to compost tea in a moment. So if you want to compost bones, you would first use this Bokashi method, and there is a link in the chat on how to do that. So you can compost the bones and the fat, or pre-compost it, and then put it in your compost pile or bin and let it finish that way. And the thing on the right is one of those solar waste digesters. You've seen green cones. It's not really composting, but it's breaking down food using heat. And they're often sold as breakdowns for dog waste in your yard. But they're not really a compost, but they will break down. That's one way to get rid of dog poop. Okay, Leah, next slide. I think it's yours.
Yeah, so someone asked about compost tea, I think, and you'll read, if you read on gardening, or you're reading different things on organic gardening, you'll frequently come across using compost tea. And there is some controversy around compost tea. I wanted to put a little bit of it out there that there's some controversy that there's a belief that if you foliar feed, which basically means if you put compost tea directly onto the plants and the plant leaves, that there is a possibility of transmitting E. coli to the plant. So it's not really recommended that you do that. It's recommended that you use your compost tea and just water it into your soil. and then you're completely fine. It's when you put do the foliar feeding that you want to, just check into that and make sure. I would not recommend that you do that. I would recommend that you put it into the ground. And when you foliar feed, you would have a sprayer and you would spray your leaves. And versus watering the tea right into the soil. So I do make compost tea, but I make it using the vermicomposting. So I have two composting systems. I have outside, I have compost pile, and then I also indoors in my basement have in this couple slides ago, Sue showed the vermicomposting, that condo thing that was in the middle picture of the stacks where the worms will eat their ways up. I use that for compost tea for my garden. So, I mean, it's you want to get like a low strength, it's a leachate, what you get out of there. And you take basically the worm castings or the finished compost. By worm castings, it's just a nice way of saying the worm poop. And you add about a pint of the finished compost to a 5-gallon bucket. And then you add unsulfured molasses to that, which seems really crazy. So I just, buy the grandma's molasses that you use to make, cookies out of at Christmas time. And you add 3 gallons of water and aerate that for 2 to 3 days. And that's just an aerator that I got at a fish supply house. It's just what they use in fish tanks. And, by having your compost tea in a liquid form, it makes it readily available to the plants. And it's, just a really good source of like, it serves as a fertilizer of feeding the soil and feeding the plants in a compost tea method. So that is, one use or application when you have your finished compost. Now, I did this example here I show is using the vermicomposting, but you can do the same thing with compost that comes from a compost pile or bin outside.
So how you can use just the solid compost by not making it into a tea is as soil amendments, which would add nutrients and condition the soil. So you need to know that it's too rich to be used as is for planting, because if you do that, you end up with things like your tomatoes won't fruit. It's just so rich that the plants won't flower and make their fruit. So uh, the this is not as rich as fertilizer that you would buy if you were going to apply an organic or inorganic fertilizer. So the NPK or nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium level is like 0.5 to 0.25 to 0.08. Usually if you see those bags sitting in the big box store, they're like 10, 20, 20, or they have big numbers on them. So this is just telling you it's not as nutrient rich, but it's great. It can be added almost any time and you'll never burn any of your plants. So if you added manures to your compost bin or pile, that will increase the nutrient levels. But if you're just using your kitchen waste, you're going to have lower levels, which is okay. So these pictures just show you how it can be used as a side dressing. So you can mix it into, that as a side dressing means you apply it to the side of the plants, just sprinkle it on. The second picture showing the lawn is top dressing. So that's where, this is what I do a lot with mine. I just take the material out of the bin and put it in a container and I just toss it on top of my lawn. And you can, again, do this any time of year. It's not like fertilizing your lawn and you have a specific time you're supposed to do it with fertilizers and all that. You do it anytime. The third picture from the left is showing it being mixed into containers. And, if you have a container and you're not buying Miracle Grow or something like that, you're buying a material that doesn't have any nutrients in it, you would want to mix in some of your compost to give it nutrients. And then lastly, um, oh, there's a question here. Lastly, is showing it as mulch, so you can just apply it on top of the bed or your planting area as a mulch. Uh, all right, so I shouldn't put some compost in the hole when I am putting vegetable plants in my garden. It depends on what's what your soil is like. You could do that, but I would mix it a little bit and not put the roots directly in contact with only the compost, because although they're small then, and it probably won't matter at that time, what happens is if they're in pure compost and they start growing and they're exposed to the nutrients a whole lot, all the time, that's where you're going to have a problem. So I'm thinking a sprinkle of it in a hole isn't going to matter, but you don't want to have a huge amount that you put the plant in and then that material doesn't have a chance to break down and mix in before the plant is going to flower. Okay, next slide. So a little bit of troubleshooting. So smell is often something that people complain about, and most problems can be fixed pretty easily just by changing the food, the water, the oxygen amount. So then you could, by doing that, you can change which organisms are there, or you can give the organisms a boost. So if you've got, as I said before, it's the organisms that can live without oxygen that are the stinky ones that are the neighbors are going to complain about. So if your compost pile has a bad odor, like a mixture of rancid butter and vinegar and rotten eggs, that's generally that you've got not enough oxygen, or which can mean you aren't stirring it, or it means that the pile is too wet, which is also preventing the organisms from getting oxygen. So the solution is to stir it if your pile looks like, well, it's not too wet, it just may need to be stirred because you've got pockets of too much green, or you may need to just stop adding water or keeping it from adding water, or maybe they say, dry it out somehow. Sometimes the odor smells like ammonia, and that generally means you have too much nitrogen in there. So that solution is easy, which is to add brown. So you've got, paper bags or leaves, let it, mix that in. And then if you've got animals or insects flying around, that may be that you've got rotting food exposed, because if you are putting the food in there and you're kind of sticking it down below some leaves, the insects aren't going to get it, and you're not going to have a lot of flies buzzing around. So just try to bury that food in the center. So the other side is when your pile is just sitting there, or you're looking at your bin and the level isn't dropping, and that can be because you have too much brown in there, and that the organisms don't have what they need to really break down things. It could also mean that the organisms don't have enough moisture, or that they don't have enough oxygen. So you have to look in there and see, do I need to add more brown, or I need to add more green? Is it too dry? What do I have to do? It can also be the volume issue. Like if the pile is too small or too big, it may just sit there. So one thing that you can do is, if there's too much brown, besides adding, if you don't happen to have a lot of greens handy, you can add some high nitrogen materials like blood meal or urea. Those are two organic materials, and they'll get your compost cooking. Uh, you can, if it's a water problem, just add water, and if it's an aerate problem or a size problem, you just have to address that. Another problem can be that you might have matted material inside there, so that's always a problem, a possible problem with leaves. So you can have a non-decomposing layer of leaves stuck in there somehow. So this happens a lot more in a bin. I've seen this happen, but they do sell, like I say, a corkscrew like device that you can mix up so you can break those layers. And and you might also see, well, I've got some big pieces in there, and you may need to get in there and chop those back up. So that's all that I have. So are there any, Leah, you have any more comments on this? And we have time for questions.
Yeah, we have time for questions. I think,
I don't see any yet.
so compost tea, so I shouldn't put some compost in the hole. Those are questions you talked about.
Right. Right. Don't overdo putting compost in the hole is what I would say. And you can always side dress later.
So if you have any other questions, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask them live or put them in the chat box here.
Well, or you can always contact the Kane County Master Gardeners. The help desk is open. So we have 3 ways that you can contact. You can directly go to the extension office on Randall Road in the 500 block in St. Charles. Oh, here we go.
Yeah,
You can email or you can phone. So there's the location, 535 South Randall Road. You can bring in. Oh, someone says they don't have the links in the chat. Could you post them again? So, yeah, Leah, can you get those posted?
Yeah.
And I'll just talk about, yeah, these are the help desk hours, but the email is always open, and it's really great if you email and you send a picture of the problem if you have a problem, because those are the easiest ones to answer besides walking in with the problem in your hands, which sometimes you can't do because it's a limb on your tree. So we're always happy to answer questions. We love them. So please feel free to contact your master gardeners. And then here are your resources. Thanks, Leah.
All right.
I don't see any more questions, so I think we're done.
Janet, was there anything else you needed to, any other programs that are coming up that you needed to announce?
We do have a poetry reading program coming up, not related to gardening, I know, but that'll be a live program coming up the last Tuesday of April for National Poetry Month. Oh, I see one new chat, it looks like. Oh, just saying thank you.
Yeah, it's thank yous. Well, you're all welcome. We like talking about this, and we love
don't be intimidated by it. Try it, and you can't really go wrong. So.
Okay, well, thank you, Leah and Sue. We enjoyed it.
Well, you're welcome, and again, thank you everyone for coming.
Right.